All right. So there are a couple of different ways to animate within After Effects, all right? And the two methods are a process called sequencing of images or visuals, and then there's also point-to-point, which is in other animation programs is kind of the equivalent of tweening, where you actually tell it where you want a motion to start and where you want it to end, and After Effects takes care of the rest of the work. So, two different ways of animating. You choose one or the other based upon the effect or based upon what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Sequenced images tend to be, sequencing is used in things like stop motion or stop motion, basically, I guess. And it's an effect you can work towards. Most other forms of it, the point-to-point method is used when you want smoother movement across time. So segmenting can be kind of a jerky kind of a thing, which is the effect, and point-to-point is a much smoother kind of a movement. So I think it's easiest to look at segmenting first. Yeah.
Can I get in? Can I open the door for him?
Yeah, sure. So I think sequencing is the easiest one to kind of start with. And so I'm just going to create a new composition in After Effects. And it's going to be .24 frames a second, about 15 seconds long. All right. And then say OK. And we should have our composition like this. So I'm just going to give it a background. I'm going to try to avoid just using black backgrounds this semester. So I'm going to go down here to my timeline, select it, and if I go up to the layer menu, layer, new, the second one down is a solid, select that, and pick a color for it. It's automatically going to set the dimensions to your composition. So do that, and then just pick a nice background color for it, something kind of subtle. Leave it the color name, or call it background. And then I'm just going to lock that down here. So if looking down in my timeline, go out here to this set of switches, and underneath the lock, I'm just going to lock that layer down so that I can't move it around by accident. It's easy to grab things you don't want and move them around, so we'll do that. So the next thing I'm going to do is just go up here to my tools bar and grab an ellipse. And place that on my screen somewhere. And it can be either any color you want. Mine has a stroke on it, but I'm going to take that off. Just do a dark colored shape. All right? So we've got our solid background, got a ball that I drew, and I want to make sure that the center point, the anchor point on this is centered up to the object. So remember I said before that usually whenever you draw a shape, on your composition window, wherever you draw it, the anchor point is actually going to be at the very center of the composition. So, and actually the color I have, it doesn't show it very well, but I just want to make sure the anchor point's right in the center of this object. So I'm going to select that circle, and if I right-click on it, right-click or control-click on it, in this menu of items, I can go down to Transform, and then I'm going to go down here 2/3 of the way down, center anchor point within the layer content, and select that. And that should make sure that the center, my anchor point's in the circle. So now if I rotate this around, it'll rotate right on my circle. Remember, if we deselect that and draw another circle, if I draw another circle out here, you don't have to do this one, but if I draw this out here, see the center point's all the way out here in the middle of my composition. So if I just grab this to spin it, it's going to rotate around that center point in the middle of the composition, which is not what I want. So I simply right-click on that, transform, center anchor point to layer content. And that puts the center point right in the middle of the circle. My first circle wasn't showing that very well, so. All right. So I'm going to use this one, and I'm just going to drag it down here right about to the middle. So like I said, sequencing of images is done when you have a still image. So back up real quick and just kind of review. Remember that an animation or video really isn't a moving kind of a thing. It's actually a whole sequence of still images all together in a line, and when you play through them, it gives the illusion of motion. So I set this composition up at 24 frames a second, which means that basically 24 images within 1 second of time are going to make up this motion. So whether it's, so if I have 1 second animation, there's going to be 24 frames in it. 2 second animation, there's still going to be 24 frames per second, but it'll be a total of 48 frames, etc. So what I'm going to do, since we're doing sequencing, is I want each individual image to be on screen for just a certain number of frames. And if I go down here to my timeline, you'll see that here's my shape layer that I made. Call this my ball. And I only want this to be about 2 frames long. So if I slide my playhead out here to actually that's seconds. Let me scale in. You can. It might actually be Command Arrow. I forget off the top of my head. But either way, I want to go out here and place my playhead at 2 frames. So I scaled in my timeline, put my playhead at 2 frames. And now if I select just this ball, and there's a couple of commands on my keyboard, I can trim this to just this shape to be just this length, 2 frames. So if I hold down the Option key and use the close bracket key, it's going to trim everything after my playhead. If I do the open bracket key, it's going to be everything before the playhead. So hold down the Option key, hold down the close bracket, and you'll see that it trimmed my shape's duration on the screen down to 2 seconds. And it actually shows us 3 seconds, which is a little misleading because the first second it actually goes up. 2 frames will actually show up to the third frame. So, but here's the major difference about this. So if I slide this playhead along, and whenever I slide this playhead off from over top of that ball, it goes away off screen. So it'll be on screen for as long as this blue bar is in my timeline. So that's just, a couple of frames long. And then selecting this ball, I'm going to duplicate it. So I've got it selected in my timeline. If I hit Command D on my keyboard, it's going to make a duplicate of it. See it? And it stacks it right up above. And I can drag this out a little bit further. And then on this second instance, I'm actually going to move it out to here. So I've got 2 of the same shape, but I'm sequencing this image. So for 2 frames it's there, then it moves to there for 2 frames. If I duplicate this again, I'm actually going to duplicate it a few times, so I've got a bunch of them. And I'm just going to sort of manually pull these out. There's a more automated way to do this that we'll do later, but just to explain the difference in sequencing versus if I play through this is going to be fairly short, but and that's what sequenced images look like. It's basically stop motion for all intents and purposes. I'm doing it with just a shape on my canvas or on my composition, but we can shoot photography this way as well. So if I can also select all of these. Stretch these out just a little bit longer maybe. And I get kind of an overlap motion. Pull my trim bar in so that so it doesn't try to play all 15 seconds. But that's basically, that's what sequencing is. It's each image only exists on the screen for a set period of time. The next time it shows up, you actually move it to a new position, and that is kind of what gives you the stop motion effect, by and large. So like I said, it is primarily for effect, but nonetheless, that's what sequencing is.
So each of those blue lines represent a keyframe, or?
Yeah, so actually did you say keyframe?
Yeah.
Actually, I haven't used keyframes at all yet. which is the other difference. Sequencing doesn't use keyframes itself. It's simply, sequencing is an image and a pose for just a specific period of time on screen in order to give the illusion of movement. So I haven't really keyframed. All I've done is for each of these different instances of the ball, I've just moved it on screen a bit. So it kind of gives us that stop motion kind of effect. We'll look at more, there's a little project we'll do with sequencing later on, but just to explain the difference between the two processes, the two methods, this is what sequencing is. Each instance of the object is just in a different spot on the screen. And we can actually give us a little bit more realistic movement later on when we talk about this, but basically the closer all these frames, all these movements are together, the slower it appears to move. The further apart they are, the faster it appears to move. So that's what sequencing is. On the other hand, actually, I'm just going to create a new composition. Same dimensions as before. So I've created a new composition. This time I'm not actually going to place, before I've actually placed a solid as my background. But one of the things to point out is that when you create a solid, it actually creates a folder up in your project window. And if you open it, that solid will be in that folder. So this time all I really need to do, if I want to use the same color, drag it down into my timeline, and I've got that color background. So point-to-point movement is different. Actually, let's lock that down. And then, so I'm going to draw my circle again and right-click on it. Actually, grab my selection tool up here in my toolbar, select it, right-click on it, go down to transform, center, anchor point, and layer content. So my center point's in the middle. And if I want to animate this from one side of the screen to the other, I'm going to start it here. And if I come down into my timeline, select this. Remember I said, so all of our different objects have different options underneath them. But the one set of options they all have every time is transform. And inside of transform, we've got our anchor point position, scale, rotation, and opacity. So if I want to move this from one side of the screen to the other, I'm going to put my playhead right at the very beginning of my timeline. And I'm going to go down here to my transforms options, and under position, I'm going to set a keyframe for that, to the earlier question, by simply clicking on the stopwatch, and it turns blue. And you see it drops a keyframe right here on my timeline. So if I want to do, let's see, I'm going to make this kind of short. I'm going to pull my trim bar in to about 3 seconds. And then I'm going to take my playhead and I'm going to move it out here to the end of my work area. Select this object and drag it across. And when I do that, you should see a line running across the composition window. And that shows the path, our animation path. So now if I slide back to the beginning and tap on my space bar, it'll slowly move from one side to the other. And that's keyframe animation. We did keyframe animation in Premiere, but keyframe animation in After Effects is a little more, it's easier to see for one thing, but it's also more robust. So that was kind of slow. I think actually I want that to only last about a second, moving across the screen, so I can just slide my endpoint in to 1 second. And now it moves a lot quicker. I could even duplicate my shape layer. If I duplicate that now, all of its keyframes will go with it. And maybe this set, I pull out to 2 seconds, and I'll duplicate it again, open it up, and I'll pull that one out to 3 seconds. So now I have 3 circles. The first one goes pretty, they're all just, one's a little bit slower than the other one. And we adjust our timing by putting our keyframes closer together or spacing them further apart, one of the two. Any questions on that so far? Still with me? So here's the thing to remember about setting keyframes. If I'm thinking that, you know what, I really don't want this, and if my playhead actually happened to have stopped out here somewhere, and I'm thinking, you know what, that last one, I don't want it to last full 3 seconds, it really should be a little different, and I just decide, you know what, it shouldn't be here, it should be over here. Anytime I move that object, when I have my keyframes set, it's actually going to move the position at that point in time. So because my playhead was back here, watch what happens. So that's going to go all the way out, but then which really wasn't the effect I wanted. Because I moved it, and my playhead wasn't where I thought it was, it dropped a keyframe in a spot that I really didn't want it. That tends to be the one thing that messes most people up when they're first learning to keyframe like this. If you ever do that, all you need to do is select that keyframe that was dropped, select it, and delete it. All right. Do I need to do anything again, or we all good? So, most of the animation we'll do is done this way, probably, I'm thinking. But as you notice, I've only got 3 objects here in my timeline, and I've got all of their transform panels open. And it's really kind of filling up my workspace, isn't it? I mean, it's, you know, imagine getting 30, 50 elements in this timeline with some of the transform windows open. It gets pretty long, it gets pretty confusing, pretty messy pretty quickly. if I know that all I want to work with is my position on my timeline, I'm just going to select all three of these individually. I've closed them all back up. If I tap the P key on my keyboard, it'll only open the position transform. And if I tap the S key on my keyboard, it'll only open the scale. The rotate, if I tap the R. And if I want to only bring up my opacity, I got to tap T, because O's already used for something else. But that's a way to kind of keep the timeline manageable when we're working with transforms. There's pretty much isn't anything we put on screen that we're not going to be working with it, moving it around and using the transforms. So working with them effectively kind of becomes important. And conversely, if I just select one of them and tap the T or tap the P key, that gives me just my position transforms. And I can kind of slide those around if I want. All right. So let's look at scale really quick. I'm going to close this up, and I'm just going to turn off these three that I just made, or that I was working with, these three circles. And I'm going to go back and grab another ellipse. Actually, let's do a square, a rectangle this time, or a square. So this time, I'm going to just draw out a square on my screen. If I hold down the Shift key and click, it'll constrain it. And then remember, I still want to move my center, the anchor point, to the middle of this object. So I'm going to select it with my selection tool, right click on it, transform, center, anchor point, and layer content. So my anchor point's centered. And then I'm going to center it in my composition. So I'm just going to right click on it again, go down to transform, and I'm going to center it in the view. And that'll move it right to the middle of my composition. So the square is centered in my comp. All right. And so if I select, click on just the side handlebar now on this object and move it in, it's going to scale that left to right, in and out, but it's going to do it right off of that center point, right off the anchor point. So I could stretch this out, stretch it down, squish it down a little bit if I wanted, adjust it that way. But what if that's not the way I want to transform it? For instance, when we start talking about animation principles, the squash and stretch and that kind of thing, and bouncing a ball, we never want it to actually compress on the center point. We want it to actually compress on the edge that's going to touch a surface and bounce off of. So if I come up here into my toolbar, there's this snapping checkbox. Make sure that that's checked. And then go over here, and right next to the rotate tool is that pan behind tool, or the anchor point tool, which is also, by the way, Y on your keyboard. So if I just tap the Y key on my keyboard, it'll bring up that tool. And I'm going to click on my center point and move it over to the right-hand edge of my rectangle. And now if I go back over here to my selection tool, which is V on my keyboard, if I tap the V tool, or the V key, it'll give my selection tool. Now if I grab the handlebar here on the left-hand side it's going to scale to where that anchor point is. And if I want, tap Y again, grab my anchor point, I'll move it to the bottom edge, tap my V key again for my selection tool, and then anytime horizontally it'll go on that point, but vertically it'll scale and leave the bottom edge in place. So if I just slide this whole rectangle down here a little bit, or here, let's do this. Put it in the middle. I can select my shape layer, tap S on my keyboard for scale, set a keyframe for that, and then I'm going to move ahead 12 frames, or half a second, and I'm going to grab this top handlebar, scale this down, move ahead 12 frames again, scale it back up. So basically, I scale the object, animate the scale of it. Comes back up. Maybe when I come over another 12 seconds, this time I grab either the left or the right side, scale that in, kind of narrow, come back to 2 seconds, scale it back out. Now when I play that through, and I can animate that object that way. Any questions about what I did there? What if I decide that 2 seconds is too fast? I'm going to pull my trim bar back out here to say 3 seconds. Maybe I want it to happen over 3 seconds. If I marquee select all of those keyframes together so they're all selected, and hold down my Option key, click on the last one, I can proportionally drag all those out to my new length. See how they all kind of scale out, accordion out? And now the motion's a little slower. So I just kind of free-handed all of that, you know, where I scaled all these things out to. But let's say, so I squish this down, and then when it comes back up here, I need it to be exactly the same height that it was in the first place. I can go over here, select just this first keyframe, and copy it. Come over here to this keyframe, delete it, but then paste the keyframe I just copied. And at this, on this keyframe and this keyframe, its scale parameters are going to be identical, because I just did a copy paste kind of a thing. Same thing goes for out here. I can select this, delete it, paste that first keyframe back in, so that when it plays through, it's entirely seamless and loops. And that's the way that I can ensure that my first frame, my first frame matches my last frame exactly, so that when I play it, it loops seamlessly. But, like I said, getting to know that anchor point is kind of important, because when you animate, you don't always want to animate off the center of the object. You usually want to animate off a different edge, corner, or even some other space out in your composition area. I mean, maybe I actually want, so let's see, that's doing its scale thing. Let's do this. Actually, let's make another object to do this. I'll turn that one off, hide it. I'll draw another rectangle. Do like I've been doing, transform, center my anchor point in the layer content, and then I want to center it. Go to transform, center in the view. Maybe I decide this time instead I'll tap the Y key on my keyboard, grab the anchor point, and slide it over to the edge of my composition, all the way out here. And then I can grab my rotate tool, rotate my shape up all the way up here off my comp. Set a keyframe for that. So this should be R for rotate. Come over here to my 2 second mark. Should have keyframed my anchor point. I'll keyframe my anchor point as well. There we go. Now I'll come out to 3. Undo that. There. And then, all right. Now let's do that again. I got to pay attention to what I'm doing. You got to pay attention to what you're doing sometimes. So, got that selected, grab that, select that object, my anchor point tool, Y, let's just slide it over. And then grab my rotate. Do that. So the keyframe, come across to 2 seconds. And rotate an object off of that center point. So if I move my anchor point around, I can get different effects on the transforms that I apply to an object. So remember, the selection tool is V, the anchor point tool is Y on your keyboard, or the anchor point pan behind. Kind of helps speed up your workflow a little bit when you use the keys, the keyboard keys. Tap R for rotate, P for position, S for scale, and T for opacity. Any questions on that thus far? Okay. But those are the basics of animating objects on the screen. So we can put all those together as well. So if let's do something different. A new composition, same size as before. I'm just going to use my same blue background in it, like I did before. This time I'm going to go up here to my toolbar, and instead of a primitive shape, I'm going to grab my type tool and place some text on the screen. So when you place text on the screen, over here in your properties panel, you get all your type options. Type options work in After Effects the same way they work in Illustrator and the rest of them. If you've got too much space between characters that you want to adjust, place your cursor between it, hold down the Option key, and your left and right arrow keys will allow you to kern your type so that they're all spaced well. This black. So the anchor point when I set type, you'll notice sets the anchor point automatically on the baseline of the text, and where it's at on the baseline will depend upon the alignment that's set under the paragraph section of the type parameters. So the last time I did this, I had my text centered, so my anchor point's centered on the baseline. If I left justify it, now my anchor point's on the left-hand side of my baseline. And I can also right-click on it, on the text, transform, center the anchor point in the layer content, and it'll move it to the middle of the type element. So set a block of type within a composition about that size in the middle. All right? And put your anchor point in the middle of that type element. So we should have this. So what I'm going to do is animate this so that it actually comes up from the bottom of the screen to the middle. It's going to spin around. Scale a couple of times, and then go off the top. All right? And I only want it to happen over a period of about, let's do 6 seconds. So if I'm going to grab my trim bar, move it down to 6 seconds, sort of scale into it a little bit. And I think the way I'm going to time this out is that I'm going to go about 1.5 seconds. At 1.5 seconds, I want it to hit the middle of my composition window. So if I move my playhead there, and in my type, if I open my position parameter, I'm going to set a keyframe there. But remember I said that I want it to actually come in from the bottom. So if I move my playhead now back to 0 and slide my type element down, it comes up from the bottom. So I kind of did it backwards that way. In the examples I did before, I animated forwards from the starting point to the end point. This time I started kind of in the middle, and I went back to set a point. So this comes out to here, and remember I said I wanted to rotate. So at this point, select my type, tap the R on my keyboard for rotation, set a keyframe there, and then I'm going to move my playhead forward to about 212. Grab my rotate tool. I'm going to rotate it 360 degrees. So now my animation comes up, rotates, and then from here, I just want it to go off the top of the page. So I'm going to come out here to about 4 seconds. Actually, let's open up all of our parameters and see what we have. So actually right here, I actually want to set, because I want this type to hold in place. So I'm actually going to set another position keyframe here as well. And I can do that by, where my playhead is at, select position. And if you come back here to the far left-hand side, you'll see a couple little arrows with a dot in between them. And if I don't actually want to move that object, I can come back here and just click on that dot. And that'll set a keyframe for that position as well. So keyframes will be set either when I click that dot or when I move an item to a new position. And now I'm just going to come out here to 4 seconds. Take my type, pull it to the top of my screen, and I'll pull my trim bar in then to 4 seconds. And now if I play this, oh, that's interesting. There we go. Now if I play this from start to end, slides up to the middle, spins around, and keeps on going. And now I've got my position, I've got keyframes on my position parameter, and I've also got them on my rotation parameter, or transform. So that's nice and structured. It comes up, it spins, and it goes off. Nothing in nature actually moves that way, though, unless it's an automated kind of a thing. So we actually probably want to throw a little bit of variation into this. Maybe what I'm thinking is that when it comes up, maybe it actually starts rotating just a little bit before it gets to the middle of the screen. And maybe it starts moving off the screen again a little bit before the rotation actually ends. So I can adjust the way this behaves by simply coming down here to my rotation line. And I'm going to pull my keyframe for rotation a little bit, like, let's go 12 seconds to the left. And then I'm going to pull my keyframe for rotation at the end about the same distance to the right. So now when this animates in, it comes in and it starts rotating early and then goes off the screen. So it's not quite so mechanical anymore. It's a little more fluid. And by and large, fluid movement like that is the way things move in nature, move in real life. Unless we're trying to actually emulate something automated, like a packaging line, you know, and maybe we're doing an animation of a packaging line or something mechanical, a robot of some kind. But we simply change the way things behave by moving the keyframes around. Maybe this actually stops for a little while and spins real quick. So I can grab this key. So maybe I stop playing. I should stop it playing. It gets funky. Maybe I move that in there and I move this rotation keyframe in here. Now what happens? Now it comes in at the same speed that we had it before, spins, flips real quick, and goes off. We didn't change the movement at all, but we changed the timing. So an animation is all about timing. Any questions about that? Or do I need to back up and do something again? Anybody? So that's kind of a simple, goofy little looping animation, but it does the trick. There are a lot more refinements that should be done to this, but for what we're doing, where we're at, this is good. Usually you want these movements to be a little smoother, things not to actually come to full stops abruptly. We can adjust all that kind of stuff, which we'll look at another night. But so that's kind of the way we animate stuff. I can make it come on screen quicker by adjusting my positions, keyframes, and comes in quicker, sits there, spins, and then leaves. Same set of stuff, I'm just moving the keyframes around, changing the way it behaves. So I moved everything on screen when I did my movements, my rotations. Just know that you can also do them from the timeline as well. By sliding these values and these numbers. But I don't know. I like manually moving things when I can. But that's a very basic way in which that's the way we animate in After Effects for the most part. Some things we'll do with sequenced images. Most things we'll do this way, more than likely. Through the setting of keyframes and moving things around. And we can, refine these movements, like I said. If I actually want to pull this back out here to 12. Let's put these back to where I had them. And I can smooth these all out a little bit if I select them all. Remember, if I select them all and I want to make this shorter or longer too, by the way, select all those, hold down the Option key, click on the very last one, and you can change the timing of the sequence overall. Make it all happen quicker, but proportional to what it was. So I could drop this all down to 2 seconds. Speed it up. Option key, select all the keyframes on either a line or all of them, whichever one you need to do. Marquee select around all of them, hold down the Option key, click the last one. And stretch them out to your time. All right. Any questions? Anything to see again? Let's see. Keyframes. Move things around. So let's do this. One last little exercise and then we'll move off of this. Create a new composition. Give it a background. What we're going to do is bounce a ball real quick in a very primitive kind of a way. So, new composition, same as before. Give it a background. Lock that down. And I'm going to grab my ellipse tool, draw a circle, right click on it, transform, center anchor point to layer content, and then right click on it again, and let's just transform, let's center it in the view for now, but we're going to move it around. And then the second thing I want to do, so I've got my ball in the middle of the screen, we're going to grab the pen tool up here in the bar. And I'm going to go down here to the low on in my composition and just draw a line across the bottom, or just a line segment. Go up here to, you can do a couple of different things here. You can either go up to the top bar here where it says stroke, and where it says 0, click on that and drag it over. Make it either the same color as your ball or a different color is fine. It doesn't really matter. So we've got a floor. I'm going to name this real quick. Floor. And ball. All right. So when we bounce this, so if a ball bounces, it compresses, like, the ball hits the surface and then it compresses, the top goes towards the surface, right? Gravity pulls it on through. So with my snapping selected, I'm actually going to change the position of my center point to the very bottom of the ball. And then tap V on the keyboard to go back to my selection tool. So starting at the beginning, I'm going to select the ball, hold down my shift key and drag it up out of the frame. And set on my transforms, let's see, let's start with position. I'm going to keyframe the position up out of the frame. And I'm going to come across to a second. click on the ball, hold down my shift key, and drag it down until it's just touching that white line at the bottom, the floor. So my first movement is the ball drops out of the sky, down and hits the ground. So when it hits the ground, it's going to want to squish. So I'm going to go to back over here, tap the scale, the S key for scale. And I'm going to set a keyframe there right where it touches the ground. And I'm going to move ahead half a second, 12 frames. And I'm going to scale the ball down. So now it comes down, and when it hits, it compresses. And it's going to bounce back up out of the frame. So I'm going to move ahead, let's see, compresses, and then I'm going to move ahead to about 2.5 seconds. And I'm going to start with position. So I'm going to slide this guy back up. So it bounces, but that's not doing what I want, does it? So, and the reason it doesn't is that I did not I need to have it positioned against the floor when it compresses. So I'm just going to go back here, select that keyframe, copy it, put my playhead right here directly above my rotation keyframe, paste that back in, there we go. Squishes and then bounces back up. But then as it bounces back up, I need to scale it back out to its original shape. And right about here, I'm going to copy the original shape, keyframe, and paste it there. So now it's going to, now if I play this through, comes down, squishes, and that's not very realistic, really. So there's something wrong in my timing. Maybe it should actually come over here a lot tighter. That's a little quick. Actually, yeah, that doesn't really look right. Actually, we'll do this instead. It'll spring. Let's actually stretch it. And then paste our original shape keyframe. So it'll actually stretch out a little bit and return to its original shape. The timing's not really quite right on that, but that's the basic movement. Actually, it all needs to happen faster too. And it's a little bit of jerkiness when it comes back into shape is because of the easing and the fact that it's, I haven't set all the easing parameters, but maybe I should do this. There we go. It's a little better. A looping bouncing ball. All right. All right. So anything in there to see again? Be able to follow along? At least if you came out of it with nothing more than understanding how to set keyframes, how to adjust the speed on things by sliding them around the timeline, that's kind of the biggest thing.